In this week's episode of Let's Talk About It, we're talking about red flags. We're going to define them and then even talk about some red flags that maybe aren't really red flags. And in our Faith and Context segment, we're going to talk about the second part of our church hurt conversation. And it's all about care. What does it mean to find care in Christian community? And what are some of the barriers to getting the care that we need? You're here. You've joined us. Let's talk about it. Well, hello there.
Yo.
And welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About It. I'm Malcolm Morgan.
And I'm Micah Morgan.
And we're so glad you're here with us today. How are you doing, love?
Oh, just chilling.
That's it? That's all you got for the people?
That's all I got for the people.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's my way of not overstimulating myself. Is to just tell myself I'm just chilling.
Congratulations.
Then everything else doesn't.
It's not exactly riveting podcasting content.
I'm sorry.
You don't
want me to be myself?
Right, be yourself. Do your thing. Do your thing, big homie.
How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited about doing this episode with you today.
Oh.
Season 5, episode dose.
Episode dose.
Second episode with video. Shout out to all the YouTube folks watching us live, or not live, but on YouTube. It's good to see you. What are we talking about today, love?
Oh, we're tackling a pretty light subject. Some red flags in relationships.
That's how we do it.
Yeah. Keeping it light. I think we can definitely start in a lot of places, but I think the word or the phrase red flag gets thrown around a lot. And I think people have different definitions for what that means. So why don't we start with what our definitions are?
Yes. What are your definitions of red flag?
I have to go first. I think so. A red flag is, I think it's when you're aware of a value that you have in a relationship and you notice that another person is either unwilling or unable to embody that value. Mm-hmm. So it could be a lot of things. It could be a value around what you find interesting, a value around how you show affection for one another. Yeah, that's how I would define it.
No, I think that's good. I think that value word is really important when we talk about red flags. They don't usually come from nowhere. They're not something that usually that we make up, but it's based off something that's important to us, something that we hold dear,
right?
And something that we want to have in common, particularly in a relationship with somebody. I think that's kind of the opposite of a red flag, is trying to find that commonality in your values.
Can you say more about in common? Do you mean having the same values?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because when I think about values in relationships, I'm aware that people come to relationships a lot of times with very different ideas of what's important. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes they maintain different ideas of what's important, but there's kind of an agreement that each of them is going to honor what's important for the other person. Mm-hmm. So I guess I didn't think about it as having values in common. I thought of it as just choosing to honor the other person's values. So that's interesting. I'm going to try that on. Ask myself the question, do they always have to be in common? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, so we've defined the term, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm aware of is that I'm constantly seeing conversations online on social media about, I guess the new term nowadays is ick. What is your ick? Mm-hmm. But essentially conversations around people discovering that folks have red flags. But the conversation is often later, after they've discovered and there's been some kind of weird situation that's happened in order for them to discover the red flag. Mm-hmm. So what do you think it is that keeps us from either remembering what our red flags are or noticing them sooner?
Mm-hmm. I think we have. I think we know for the most part. I feel like we know what our red flags are. Maybe not when we're younger, when we're teenagers. Maybe we don't really have the real way to vocalize and understand what those things are. But I think for the most part, we have an understanding of what they are. I think a lot of times we're willing to compromise those values. We talked about red flags being a value. I think we're willing to compromise those values in certain spaces at certain times for whatever reason. Maybe a person has been very desirable to us, and we're willing to overlook those flags. Maybe they're about to use a video game term, but their rating is high in other areas, and I'm willing to compromise on those things that I would have considered important to me, or those values that I hold dear. Yeah, that's the first thing that kind of comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. And then as you were saying that, I was also wondering about just like sheer loneliness. Mm-hmm. Like, I wonder if people are more willing to put up with someone, exhibiting their red flag because they're just like, this is better than being alone.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I also wonder, too, so you mentioned that sometimes we don't really notice them when we're younger. And I agree. I think part of discovering what your red flags are is the process of finding out when people, like, I think, assume that people would have your same values in a relationship. And then you discover that they don't. And then you get language for it. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I'm thinking of is this video I saw on Instagram where there was a woman approaching a car, getting ready to, get picked up for a date. And the gentleman doesn't get out of the car to open up the door for her. Mm-hmm. And so she refuses to get in until he gets out and opens the door. But he never does. And so he gets out and essentially has a conversation with her about, like, well, why is this such a big deal for you? Like, mm-hmm. I showed up, I'm getting ready to pay for dinner. Like, this doesn't feel like a non-negotiable. And she was like, I don't touch car doors. And so he got back in the car and drove off without her. Mm-hmm. And so this was a situation where she was very clearly aware of her red flag. Mm-hmm. But there was a moment where right before he drove off where he was like, sometimes you just have to choose yourself. And I'm getting ready to choose myself. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if for him, he discovered a red flag, like someone just being unwilling to negotiate, or even, like, I think there was just this lack of, grace is the only word I can think of, but it was almost like she didn't really even give him an opportunity to learn this about her. Yeah. Like, he literally just met you for the first time. And so that's one example, I think, of perhaps someone maybe discovering, like, oh, this might be like a value of mine. Like, I think it's important for someone to have some grace or to be willing to let me learn something. Yeah. And maybe, I don't know. I don't know this for sure, but maybe he didn't have the language for that before this interaction.
Yeah, I think sometimes those red flags could feel, I think in his case, it comes up as kind of like a trap. Like an uncommunicated red flag is like, oh, well, you didn't meet this standard that I had. Well, I didn't even know that standard existed. Right. And it's kind of inconsiderate for you to just assume, or, lay it as a trap to say, oh, if he doesn't meet this unspoken standard,
there's going to be this consequence between us.
So I think that's where red flags can be really unfair, is if you have set this value that is unspoken and you don't give somebody an opportunity to meet you there. Because when it's unspoken and then it becomes a missed standard or a missed opportunity, that person is going to feel hurt. Like, well, sure, if we had talked about this, like, it would have been that big of a deal. We probably could have worked through it. Right. But the fact that you have sprung this on me now and are saying something about my character because I didn't meet the standard for you. Yeah. That I'm completely unwilling to even meet you or talk about it or process through it. Yeah. I'm just done.
Yeah. 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 And I think when I take a step back and I think about the trend of us getting online and really basically venting about it And it just makes me curious. I mean, maybe people are going to the people that they're talking about and saying, hey, by the way, I'm really ticked off that you did this thing or didn't do this thing. But we all know how humans operate. And most of the time, we're not doing that. So it just makes me think about how we put all this energy into maybe going online and humiliating the person that popped up with the red flag. But how much energy are we putting into going to that person and saying, hey, look, you maybe didn't know this, but this is really important to me. Would you be willing?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we do that a lot.
Absolutely not. And I think in our minds, it's hard for us in general as people. There's things that are important to us, and we assume that it's important to everybody. And that if they don't share that same value with you, then they're doing it on purpose.
Yeah.
That is like you're purposely doing this to get on my nerves or to hurt me or to whatever.
Or you're withholding this from me.
Yeah, that's the word. Yeah, you're withholding this from me. But I think we have to do a better job as people of communicating those things and helping people to understand why that's important. Because I think if people understood the why, maybe there is a reason why. Maybe this was something that her dad did for her and it made her feel special. And she wants to have that feeling in her relationship. That's important. And I think a person is much more willing to meet you there if they understand that why, other than you just set a standard, don't explain it, and then you're already done with the date 2 minutes in.
Yeah. And you actually just made me think about something too when you said like there was this kind of criticism within this interaction of the gentleman's character, right? And I wonder if, like, I'm thinking of times where, you know, I was not as healthy. I was a little less emotionally mature. And I can catch myself in hindsight thinking that like, oh, if this person is exhibiting this red flag, that's a sign of like a lapse of character for them, or that means they're not a good person. When I really think a more compassionate way to think about red flags is a red flag is an opportunity for a request, something that you're asking of someone.
Yeah.
And you can ask something of someone that they've simply never done before, that they've simply never been asked to do before. And it doesn't mean that there's a lapse in their character. It just means that this is a new opportunity for them. Yeah. So I wonder if we were encouraged to think of red flags that way. The red flags are always an opportunity for a request rather than criticism. I wonder if our relationships would be a little bit more communicative too.
Yeah. And in learning of the red flags, you'll learn about a person. Right. Right. It is a way to get to know somebody is kind of through their red flags, which sounds weird, but
no, like what's important to you.
Yeah. I mean, like we talked about, it's values, right? And I think we're all on the search in a relationship and interaction, getting to know somebody, of understanding what's important to them. What's their values? What do they care about? What are the things that have happened in their lives that have brought them to this moment? And it's a really interesting way to learn about somebody and be able to dig a little bit deeper into getting to know somebody. So when you leave those things unspoken, you lose that opportunity for that closeness, and to kind of close the gap between you.
Yeah. I mean, it is a vulnerable thing though.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
To come to a person and say, hey, this is important to me. Would you be willing? But I think that's a good place for us to end this part of the conversation, right? Is to just think about like, how do you go about telling a person what your red flag is?
Well, obviously you don't say anything. You get offended and upset when they don't meet it, and then shut down, and then date is over. Interaction over. We're good.
Taking some notes. Okay.
Yeah, that's it, right?
Yeah, thank God that's sarcasm. Yeah, I mean, that's the way we usually do it, right? We just assume that this person knows what our red flag is. We get upset with them silently. We go tell our friends about it in the group chat, and then the relationship is over. I like what you said a moment ago about like, maybe this person finds themselves reflecting and they think about, this is something that my dad used to do for me. And so it's important to me because it's like nostalgic. It reminds me of my dad's love. I wonder if that's, I don't know. I wonder how someone will receive that if their partner came to them and say, hey, look, yesterday we went on this date. You didn't open the door for me. And that had me feeling a little disappointed, had me feeling unimportant. And I thought about it, and the reason was because this is something that my dad used to do for me. It helped me feel really loved and special. Would you be willing to do that in the future?
Yeah.
I think that person would probably feel a little bit more open
Absolutely.
to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It changes the conversation from you didn't do this, you're a bad person, to this is why this is important to me. And and making a request, not necessarily expectation.
Right. And probably if we were to think about red flags as this is important to me, and then ask the question why, we would probably discover whether or not a red flag is like a legit red flag, or is this something that you really could negotiate or compromise on?
Yeah.
Because I don't know, like I'm thinking about myself. I'm not a super, I don't know, I guess conservative person, but having someone open the door for me or not. And this is just me, right? I'm not that woman that we're thinking of, right? She's got a whole different life. But in my brain, that wouldn't be something that would be like non-negotiable.
Yeah.
But it seemed like for her it was. So if you reflect on your red flag as a request, as something important to you, that gives you an opportunity to say for yourself, why is this non-negotiable? What does it mean to me that a person is unwilling or unable to do this?
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe this is also, when we think about red flags, is an opportunity to reflect on that. Like, is it really a red flag? And if so, why? Yeah.
Yeah. I think to add into this conversation about real red flags versus, I think, maybe not so, maybe ones that are more negotiable, I think it's this idea of settling. I think people want their standard to be met, and they don't want to have to settle for something less than. I think you hear that a lot in these conversations around people's red flags. Like, oh, I'm not going to settle for example, I'm not going to settle for a man that doesn't make this much money. Or I'm not going to settle for a man that doesn't have a house already, or doesn't have no kids, or whatever. Oh, no. I'm not going to settle for these things. And I think people think of that as settling. Yeah. They don't think of it as either compromise or evaluating the reason for this red flag or this value. They look at it as my standard is here, and I'm lowering my standards for somebody that's beneath me.
Oh my. I didn't think about that in the context of this conversation. When you imagine people thinking about it in terms of settling, what do you think their definition of settling is? I'm intrigued by that.
Lowering their standard to allow somebody that is beneath them to have access to them.
Oh my. Yeah. And I mean, that's a human thing, right? To think about people in terms of whether they're beneath us or not, which we shouldn't be doing, but we do. But wow, yeah, just thinking about if we were to shift the conversation even with ourselves then, right? Like if someone is chafing against your red flag, or they're doing your red flag, it's not, what if we reframed it as, it's not proof that you've settled, but it's proof that that person has an opportunity to learn how to show affection for you in a way that matches better. But yeah, I'm really chewing on this. I didn't think about that before.
Yeah. So I think to go along with this conversation where we're talking about things that are red flags that maybe aren't as non-negotiable, do you think, let me frame it this way, do you feel like settling, there are reasons to settle? Or maybe it's just that word settling we need to move away from and think of it more as either a compromise or something else. Yeah,
I wonder if I'm uncomfortable with the word settle itself in terms of thinking about settling for a person. Like, because we're never a finished product. And I think to imagine that you're settling for someone is to also freeze them in place and to say that they don't have the capacity or potential to change. And I mean, this is probably the therapist and the pastor in me, but I just don't think of people that way. So when you said that, I was like, oh, yeah, that is a thing that we think, but I just hadn't thought about it in a while. So yeah, I think it's the discomfort that I have with what the word settling implies about people.
Yeah.
That makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah. So do you feel like compromise, or is there a better word for it than settling?
Maybe compromise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because and I'm recognizing that I'm sitting in privilege right now, right? Because we've been married for over 10 years. We have not been in the dating pool for a while, and I've just been hearing about how treacherous that is these days. So I want to acknowledge that I don't have lived experience around this.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who has just discovered, that a guy has a red flag, or maybe even a friend, right? Like maybe a friend is doing a red flag. Yeah, I wouldn't think of it as, so let's say I presented that to them and they said, you know what, nope, I'm actually not able to do that. Would I think of it as compromising? Maybe. Like if I were to stay in that relationship with them. Or maybe I just feel more comfortable with the word grace, like I'm offering that person grace. If I choose to stay in that relationship after they've said, nope, I'm not able to honor your red flag, that's me making a choice to say, okay, I'm gonna love you anyway in spite of that. That feels more like grace. Compromise feels more transactional than that. But maybe I'm just mincing words too. What about you? Like, does compromise feel like a better word to describe what you would be doing if you were to kind of stick with somebody after they said, nope, can't do that?
Yeah, I think I understand the chafing at the word settling. Compromising doesn't quite feel right, but I don't have a better alternative.
Yeah.
But I do think there is a process we have to go through when we look at some of the red flags that we have, and really go through the process of deciding, why is this a red flag? Why is this a value for me? And is this something that is it something that I'm trying to be self-protective of? Is this something that I've seen and observed that I'm trying to avoid? Is this really, does this red flag reflect on the character of a person? Or is this more cosmetic than that, or more superficial than that? And in that case, I think that's when you need to kind of reevaluate the red flag is, if this, I'm trying to think of an example, like, person has to be a certain height, for example. But does it talk about the heart of a person, or the character of a person, or how that person treats me? So I think it's important to kind of evaluate the standard that you are trying to uphold, and how that affects the way that you are in a relationship with people.
Yeah. And maybe even ask yourself, can I live without this?
I think that's a tough, in the moment, that's a tough question to answer, because obviously you set the standard for a reason, because you feel like it's that important to you. So I think most people can talk themselves into that. Into
saying, nope, I can't live without this.
Yeah.
But that also begs the question, are our red flags really well thought out in the first place? I think most of them are just reactionary, and probably subconscious.
Yeah.
And so if that is the case, maybe this is also an invitation to be a little skeptical about our red flags just from the beginning, to just know that they're probably only giving you partial information anyway.
Yeah.
And so to ask yourself, can I live without this, is a legit question, because you probably can, because at some point you weren't getting the thing that you're considering breaking up with this person about. So I don't know. This is an interesting conversation, because I think it's asking us to be honest about how insufficient red flags are as decision makers about whether we stay connected with someone.
Yeah.
It's just a piece of the information we need.
Yeah. I agree. Well, there's not a great stopping point of this conversation, but
yes,
this conversation,
we figured it out. All the answers are there.
Well, the point I was trying to make is that this doesn't have to end. We'd love to hear your feedback on this part of this episode. What language makes sense to you? Does settling sound like the right words? Does compromise sound like the right words? How do you evaluate your red flags? We'd love to hear from you. Use the hashtag #TalkAboutIt, POD. and continue this conversation even beyond the episode.
Yes, indeed.
Now, there's really no great way to pivot to this, guys. So, church hurt. We've talked about this quite a bit in different forms, but we also had a whole half episode dedicated to church hurt.
Yep, back in 2021.
Back in 2021, in the throes of the pandemic.
My goodness.
And I think church hurt is still something that is a buzzword. Maybe not the same intensity that it was before. We're not all living only online anymore.
Right.
So the conversations, are happening in much different spaces.
Yeah.
But I think the conversation has evolved, and I think we've gotten some more clarity on some different aspects of this. And so today we're going to be talking about care in Christian community. So Micah, can you help people understand where we're going today with this church hurt conversation?
Yeah. I think one way to understand where we're going is to kind of understand where we've been. So when we had the conversation back in June 2021, we talked about a lot of different elements of church hurt, but I think one of the things we didn't quite articulate or maybe have the words for is that while church hurt is often connected to an abuse of power, because we kind of talked about Dr. Allison Cook's definition of church hurt as an abuse of power, it can also often just be connected to like a person experiencing a lapse of care that they were expecting. Yeah. And that lapse of care can really feel like a deep wound and maybe even betrayal for people. And I don't think we kind of got to the point where we like explicitly said that in the first episode. So I think today is an opportunity to just kind of wrap some thoughts around that. What I think I would like to start with today is like why people come into a Christian community expecting the kind of care that they're expecting. Like, what are your thoughts about that in terms of like what feels different about a church community that you would expect a kind of care that maybe you wouldn't from work or from your gym membership or
Well, I can't remember if we've talked about this in this or some other episodes, but I think church people that come into church, I think expect that the people in church are quote unquote better, that they have a different moral code, a different moral compass. They treat people differently, which I don't think they're incorrect about. I think we're supposed to, as Christians and as a body of Christ, we're supposed to look, feel, act different than quote unquote the world does. So I think that's part of it, is that you come into a space and at least initially your expectation is that, okay, these people are thinking about this. They're thinking about how to care for people. I'm going to be safe here.
And I like how you ended that because so I would like to think there are good people everywhere. I do agree with you though that typically when we walk into church doors, we do have this assumption that like, oh, these people are somehow different from the other people. And there's theology around that, right? That we, the Holy Spirit lives within us. It equips us, the Holy Spirit equips us to love like Jesus loved. There should be a difference, right? And also I have this belief that humans aren't inherently depraved and that there's goodness in folks that are not in the church too. But I like that you drew the distinction of people are thinking about care differently if you're in the church. And I think that that's really true because you could have good people that you're working with, for example, every day, but they're not thinking of care as, oh, if I am embodying the mindset of Jesus, then I am exhibiting this servitude toward other people, their needs, and this desire to bless people, and that care can be an exhibition of that, right? They're probably not thinking about that. They're thinking about whatever task you need to do for work. That doesn't mean they're a bad person. That just means they have a different focus. So I really like the way that you articulated that we expect for people in church to be thinking about care differently. And
I think that's circling back to church hurt itself. I think that's why people tend to get hurt in the church, and it hurts worse.
Yeah.
And it's harder to recover from, because you came in there with that expectation of people, and you came in there with your guard down, so to speak. And then you're let down by people that you're thinking, oh, these people wouldn't do that. Like they care, you know? And then you get into that space, and then you're wounded, and you're like, well, if they're going to hurt me here, where else is there for me to go?
Right.
You know?
This was like the last resort of a space where I thought people would be thinking about care differently. What's your definition of care? Like, as we're having this conversation, how are you thinking about the word care?
I think it's the meeting of a need, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual. People come into church. A lot of times they have a need.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's tangible. They need money for bills, or rent is due and they don't have it that month, or maybe they're feeling lonely and they need somewhere they can have relationship and community and connection. And then sometimes they're lost, like they're in this world trying to figure out what to make of it, how to survive, and they need direction.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really super generic answer, but I think care circles back to a need that you have as a person. And especially when it comes to church, people are thinking that there's resources there for them to get the care they need. Even if a church isn't a big church, even a small church has something that they can offer me that is going to help meet my need.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. And I'm also thinking of conversations that I've had with people who are healing from church hurt related to care. And one of the things I hear a lot is, I experienced this insert troubling time here. And there really wasn't anything anyone could, like a need anyone could meet, but I just didn't feel cared about. Yeah. Like, no one checked on me. No one looked for me after being gone for, 4 Sundays. And so that makes me think that in addition to care being about meeting a need, that care is also about maybe affection and attention.
Yeah.
That when people walk into church doors, they're expecting that somebody's going to remember them, communicate to them that they want them around.
Yeah.
So I think care is also about attention and affection as well. And that sometimes the wound can come from, there was nobody else in the world that I thought would care, and I expected these people here to care or to give me attention and affection, and they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that fits under the need.
The need to be
a relation. I mean, it's a relational need, but
yeah, that's a good point.
I think especially as adults, we come into work and we don't necessarily feel like there's friends there. There's not school anymore where you kind of have a group of people that you're hanging out with all the time, that you invite you to parties and to come over to their house. And so church becomes that real relational space for a lot of people, where they have that connection with people that, as we talked about in the last segment, share the same values as them and care about the same things. And so when people experience hurt relationally in church, that can hurt, even deeper than anything else, because where do I go now?
Right.
There's no other space where, and then, you lose your church and you lose your community. People are, as adults, it's harder to make friends. We've talked about this in the episode before. It's harder to build relationships as an adult. So when you finally find a community and then something happens in that community and you're wounded, what do I do now?
Yeah. Where
do I go now? I have to start this all over again in a new place. I've got to trust another place and another set of people. Mercy.
What do you think gets in the way then of care? Because we know we're finite beings. We can't do anything perfectly. So in a church space, in a Christian community, what gets in the way of us being able to show care to people in the way that they're craving?
Something that just came to my mind today is, I think there are people that are perceived as high maintenance and difficult. I think we might have talked about this in the last church hurt episode. And because excuse me, because it's difficult and it's harder, those people tend to end up on the fringes and on the outside more than others would. And so I think that, unfortunately, has become something in the church that we struggle with, is the people that require a little bit more, whether it's grace, time, or patience, we reject or want to pawn off to somebody else or say they're doing too much, whatever it is. And I think that extra energy that it takes when it doesn't come easily can make it easy for people to push other people away.
Mercy. Yeah. I think you're right. And I wonder too how that would change because when I've seen that happen, it's been when like one or two people have been trying to care for someone that needed really complex needs. Mm-hmm. In hindsight, I wonder if they had expanded the team a little bit more, if they had tagged some other folks in to be like, hey, this person really needs and deserves complex care. Mm-hmm. How about you reach out to them on, Tuesday and Wednesdays, and I'll go over there on something that feels more collaborative, because what I think often happens is those two people that have been trying to care for that person get burnt out. Mm-hmm. And because they've gotten burnt out, the people around them kind of justify them tapping out and stopping the care for that person. Mm-hmm. When I think maybe it just would have been more compassionate for them to accept their limitations and tag some other people in.
Yeah. No, that's true. I think I'm reminded of the story. Was it the paralytic man whose friends brought him to Jesus? Mm-hmm. It took a community to help him and get him to Jesus. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just the man on his own figuring it out. Yeah. But he had people that cared about him and that wanted to see him healed and whole and get what he needed. Mm-hmm. It took a community to do that.
Yeah. And I'm even thinking of Lazarus, right? Jesus resurrects him, and he says to the people around him, y'all come in here and take his grave clothes off. Yeah. There's a communal element to care that I think we forget because, probably because we've got this kind of specialization of tasks idea about ministry. That some people are either best equipped or best positioned to care. Mm-hmm. But we would probably be better off if we expanded the circle a little bit more, tag some people in. Yeah. I think another thing that can get in the way of care is, I have to push myself to remember this, but as humans, we're not really super great at caring unless it's someone who like we experience as kin, or someone that we think we're going to get something back from, or some benefit attached to caring like that. Unfortunately, we have to accept that about ourselves. Most of the time, we're just going to lean toward people that we're closest to care for. And so I think that's one natural barrier to care that shouldn't come with shame, that like, oh, this just means that we're terrible people. It just means that we need to have some more intentionality around care if we know it doesn't come natural to a person that we don't immediately see as family or friend or as beneficial.
Yeah. I think another ingredient to kind of add to the conversation is I think people that have been in church change their expectation for care.
Oh,
like they go into a space and don't expect to be cared for or treated as special over somebody else. And I'm reminded of being in church and hearing the phrase, well, people don't have to be nice. To say like, oh, this community was nice to me and people don't have to be that way. And it's like, wow, that's really our expectation of people.
Wow.
In a church space of all places, that people don't have to be nice, which it's
not wrong.
It's not wrong, but it is also antithetical to
what it means to be.
Right.
Yeah. Kindness is a fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah. Right.
Last time I checked.
So people have adjusted their expectation of people because they've been disappointed.
Wow.
Or they've been in spaces that haven't been welcoming. And it's like, no, that shouldn't be the standard. That shouldn't be what we expect of people.
But it's self-protective.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
you said. Yeah, people are just like, all right, this is my 6th church community that I've tried. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to put myself out there again and hope that people will care for me. So I'm going to come up with this mantra to tell myself. Oh my goodness.
I think another barrier to care is sometimes there can be a lack of accountability.
Okay.
We've seen whether it's a pastor or other leaders who have not cared for people, and there's no one there to say, hey, we should have stepped up here. Like, we should have been the one. It's not them. It's not their fault that they left. It's we should have done this. And so that lack of accountability means that cycle will continue. When the next person comes in, the person after that, or a person from outside the community that's not perceived as the in group, without that accountability, those things will just continue to happen, and people will continue to get hurt and continue to leave.
Yeah. And that's a hard thing though, right? Because there's such a rigid hierarchy, I think, built into the Christian space. Yeah. And so if it is someone in leadership, if there's no mechanism for that accountability to happen, it's often not going to naturally happen because of that hierarchy of power. And so I think that's an opportunity then for leaders, and I'm, of course, speaking to myself, to constantly ask ourselves that question first. Like, if we see that someone has pulled away, withdrawn, or, oftentimes you hear it through the grapevine, like this person left and they're upset and they're saying all these things. That's an opportunity for us to ask ourselves, is there something that we could have done differently, maybe even seek out some feedback, hey, how did you see me interact with this person? Did you see some things that, maybe I could have done differently? So oftentimes that accountability, if we model it first, folks might be willing to step up and say, hey, I don't want to be disrespectful, but when I saw this happening, I think this was a lapse of care here, so we can do better in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So as we end, what do you think could be ways around this? Like, what is the solution? Like, if we wanted to solve the problem of a lapse of care, to minimize church hurt happening to people, how could we do that?
Yeah, I think as leaders in church spaces, I think we should really work to teach what care is, what needs are, and what people are coming into our church community looking for and coming for. I think having that understanding of why people are there, what spaces they're coming from, and what process has led them to where they are now. I think just a lot of times we expect, even churches that try to be evangelistic, we expect people to be coming from another church community where it was healthy and wonderful, but the Lord just led them here. But that is not usually the case.
It's very rarely the case.
They've been discarded, or they've been hurt, or they moved from a whole nother city. It's not everything is as clean as we want it to be.
Yeah.
So I think really helping people have that expectation and understanding that, hey, this community thing isn't always going to be clean. It's not always going to be smooth. It is not. We're not always going to see eye to eye. But the priority is to love and to care for these people when they come in the door, and for them to feel that when they leave, and not just, well, so and so, she needs a whole lot of it. I ain't got time. Like, no, we need to find out how, as a community, we can be that support system for people.
Yeah, and I think you have a point too of just saying, like, sometimes we just forget to say, like, oh, like, this person might need this thing. Who can meet that need?
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, to ask. Yeah. To ask people, like, hey, what do you need? And to be willing to ask that question more than just the first time you meet them because they're a visitor and you want to be curious and show hospitality. Yeah. But like to regularly ask the people around you, what do you need right now?
Yep.
And then I think another thing too, when you talk about teaching people how to care, sometimes, yeah, I'm trying to think of like the last time I've heard about care kind of preached about, and I can't think about it. And I wonder if that would be helpful to weave that into the theology of our church. Like, what is our theology of care and why? Like, I think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, that was a beautiful display of care, but why was it beautiful? Yeah. And why was this now, codified in the Gospels as an example that we should aspire toward.
Yeah.
So I think regularly having conversations about what does it mean for Christians to care and why is that so different and so important?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Well, love, we're about to wrap up this episode. What did we talk about today?
Well, we had a wonderful conversation about, if you can call it wonderful, about red flags and just kind of thinking through, how do we come up with our red flags? Should we always just assume red flags are legit? Should we maybe question them at some points? And then how do we communicate them? And then we ended our episode today with another conversation on church hurt and just kind of thinking about what care is and why people can be so wounded by a lapse of care. And then how can we maybe prevent people being wounded by a lapse of care in the future? But of course, this doesn't have to be where this conversation ends. So if you would like to just tell us some of your thoughts about what you have learned about your own red flags, conversations you've had, how you've communicated red flags, or just examples of church hurt that you've overcome, healed through, you are welcome to use the hashtag #TalkAboutIt, POD, or you can connect with us directly on our social media platforms. You can get to me at j.marie.morgan on Instagram. And then how can they get in contact with you?
You can find me at Malcolm DOT Media on Facebook. Take that back. Instagram, Threads. I am just recently on TikTok. I have not posted anything. But our Urban Arts Digital, you can follow us on Urban Arts Digital on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, and TikTok now. You'll be able to see our podcast clips on there. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys. Connect with us where you find us. Neither one of us is on Twitter anymore. Sorry. Yeah, Twitter doesn't exist anymore. I guess it's X now. So
can't do it.
Don't tweet us.
All right. Did we do a thing?
I think we have done a thing. This has been Let's Talk About It. I'm Malcolm Morgan.
And I'm Micah Morgan.
And we'll see you all next time.